I wasn't preparing for anything. That part matters. I wasn't worried about food. I wasn't thinking about winter. I wasn't trying to be independent or ahead of anyone else. I trusted the system the way most people do, quietly, automatically. The store shelves were full. The lights came on when I flipped the switch. Heat filled the room without asking where it came from. Protein was just there, wrapped, labeled, priced, waiting. And because it always arrived on time, I never asked how fragile that arrival really was. Nothing felt urgent. Nothing felt scarce. Nothing demanded my attention. That's how it usually begins. It wasn't during a crisis. That's the part people expect. Empty shelves, panic, headlines. But this didn't happen then. It was an ordinary winter moment. Late in the season. The kind of cold that doesn't shock you anymore because it's been around long enough to feel normal. Inside, everything still worked. Warmth, light, familiar sounds you stop noticing after years of reliability. Outside, though, the ground had already gone quiet. No growth, no movement. The kind of stillness that only shows up when the season has already made its decision. Standing there, nothing was missing, but something felt thinner than it should have. Not the shelves, the margin, because winter has a way of removing excess. It strips systems down to what actually survives, not what performs well when conditions are perfect. And that was the first time I noticed how much of my strength depended on things that only exist when everything else works. What disappeared didn't vanish during a shortage. It didn't leave behind a warning. It was already gone long before anyone felt its absence. Not because we chose to lose it, but because replacing felt easier than remembering. At some point, a quiet decision was made. Not loudly, not deliberately, just gradually, the way habits form when nothing goes wrong. I didn't understand that yet. I only knew that something essential had stopped being created and had started being delivered instead. And once that shift happens, winter doesn't cause the problem. It reveals it. It's easy to assume loss arrives with noise, with disruption, with something you can point to and say, that's when it broke. But this didn't break. It slipped. What disappeared wasn't taken during a crisis. It wasn't rationed. It wasn't announced. It faded earlier than that, when replacing became easier than producing, and no one felt punished for the trade. Protein didn't vanish. It became abstract. Something you no longer built with time, land, or patience, but something that arrived wrapped in plastic, detached from seasons, detached from effort. And because it arrived reliably, the cost of losing the knowledge to create it felt theoretical, almost outdated. The dangerous part wasn't dependence. It was how comfortable that dependence felt. Because when a system works perfectly, it doesn't ask for awareness. It rewards forgetting. I didn't notice when the shift became permanent. I don't think anyone did. But at some point, long before winter, long before prices, long before shortages, a single, quiet decision locked everything in place. Not a dramatic one, not even a conscious one, just a small trade made in the name of convenience. That made reversal impossible later. I didn't understand that decision yet. I only felt its outline. And once you feel it, you can't unfeel it. Because winter doesn't care what you believe. It only tests what still works when replacement stops. There was a time when this wouldn't have felt unfamiliar. When the gap I was sensing had a shape, a name, a place in the year. It lived in repetition. In things done the same way at the same time every season. Not because they were efficient, but because they worked. People didn't talk about it as knowledge. It wasn't written down. It didn't need explaining. It showed up in habits passed without instruction. In kitchens that changed with the weather. In routines that assumed winter would eventually ask for something in return. Grandparents didn't frame it as preparation. They framed it as normal. You grew food that didn't rush. You relied on things that didn't need perfect conditions. You respected the months when nothing grew, because something had already been set aside before the ground went still. That memory didn't disappear on its own. It was crowded out, not by malice, by speed. Convenience didn't erase it overnight. It made it unnecessary until it wasn't. And when repetition stops, memory follows. What remained wasn't ignorance. It was a system that no longer needed you to remember. And once remembering stops being useful, forgetting starts to feel natural. I didn't resist that shift. I benefited from it. The system made things easier, and it rewarded me for accepting that ease without friction. I didn't have to plan ahead. I didn't have to think in seasons. I didn't have to understand where strength actually comes from. Food became something you choose, not something you maintain. Protein became a preference, not a responsibility. And every time I reached for it and found it waiting, the system reinforced the same lesson. You don't need to know this anymore. So I stopped asking questions that had no immediate payoff. I stopped noticing how much energy it took to keep things arriving on time. I stopped distinguishing between availability and resilience. Nothing forced that compliance. Comfort did. The more reliable everything felt, the less necessary understanding became. And the less I understood, the more normal that ignorance felt. I wasn't asleep. I was functioning exactly as designed, because the system doesn't punish trust. It rewards it, until the moment normal stops carrying the weight it used to. The belief I relied on wasn't extreme. It was ordinary. That protein comes from animals. That strength is something you raise, feed, transport, and store cold. That meat is expensive because it's valuable, and scarce because it's necessary. For a long time, that belief held. Felt grounded. Logical. Animals convert plants into muscle. That's the story we're taught early, and it's convincing because it looks solid. Even when winter came, the belief didn't immediately break. The shelves were still stocked. The freezers still hummed. Prices rose, but availability remained. Just enough to feel reassuring. So I kept trusting it. But the math doesn't care how familiar a belief feels. An animal spends most of its energy staying alive, keeping warm, moving, breathing. Only a fraction becomes food. That inefficiency hides itself when feed is cheap, fuel is steady, and time feels abundant. It disappears into the background of convenience. And for a while, even after I understood that, the belief still felt true. Because the system kept compensating for it. Long supply chains covered the loss. Cold storage delayed the reckoning. Scale absorbed the waste. It worked until it didn't need to anymore. That's when the contrast sharpened. Short-term comfort versus long-term security. A system that replaces endlessly versus one that accumulates quietly. Food that requires constant input versus food that continues without attention. I didn't abandon the belief all at once. It loosened. Because once you notice how much energy is spent just keeping protein alive through winter, you start asking an uncomfortable question. What happens when maintaining heat costs more than the food itself? And more quietly, more unsettling. Why did I assume strength had to come from something that starves the moment conditions stop being perfect? There wasn't a villain behind that assumption. No single decision maker. No moment you could point to and call a mistake. The system didn't choose weakness. It chose efficiency. It optimized for speed, predictability, and scale. For things that move well, store well, and arrive on schedule. Animals fit that model when conditions are stable. They can be standardized, measured, timed. So the system built itself around replacement instead of permanence. Around inputs instead of cycles. Around logistics instead of biology. Nothing here is malicious. It's just math. A cow that requires constant feed creates recurring demand. A freezer full of meat justifies energy consumption. A long supply chain rewards uniformity over resilience. Anything that doesn't move well gets pushed aside. Anything that doesn't store long enough becomes inconvenient. Anything that keeps producing without asking for much becomes unnecessary. So the system didn't erase alternatives. It stopped making room for them. And over time, what isn't supported starts to feel unrealistic. What doesn't fit the model starts to feel fringe. The result isn't failure. It's fragility. A structure that performs beautifully as long as nothing interrupts it. And offers very little margin once interruption becomes normal. That's the part most people miss. The system isn't broken. It's simply optimized away from survival. I didn't discover an alternative on purpose. I stumbled into it the way most forgotten knowledge returns, through misuse. It started as curiosity. Something small. Something I didn't take seriously enough to respect. What caught my attention wasn't flavor or novelty. It was timing. While everything else slowed down in winter, this kept moving. Not aggressively. Quietly. It didn't need light the way plants do. It didn't need warmth the way animals do. It didn't pause to wait for better conditions. The efficiency was unsettling. What took livestock months, sometimes years, happened in days, not by scaling up, but by skipping waste entirely. That was the first insight. Nothing was being spent just to stay alive. The second thing I noticed was time. Winter wasn't an obstacle here, it was an advantage. Cold didn't kill the process. It signaled it. But I nearly ruined it by treating it like everything else. I waited too long. I assumed bigger meant better. I ignored the signs because I didn't know what they were warning me about. That mistake mattered. This kind of system doesn't punish you with noise. It punishes you quietly, through air you didn't think to question, through consequences that don't announce themselves. Once I understood the risk, I understood the difference. This wasn't food you control by force. It's food you work with by paying attention. And that's when it clicked. Strength doesn't always come from what looks powerful. Sometimes it comes from what keeps working. After everything loud and expensive stops. I'm not telling you to replace anything. I'm not suggesting you give something up. I'm only describing what happens when you notice the difference between food that depends on conditions and food that adapts to them. Once you see that contrast, it's hard to ignore, because it changes how you look at winter, at effort, at what strength actually means when systems stop compensating for us. Nothing about this requires panic, or urgency, or stockpiling. It only asks for attention. Tomorrow, when you walk past a shelf, or open a freezer, or step outside and feel the season settling in, you might notice something you didn't before. Not what's missing, but what would still function if replacement slowed down. That awareness doesn't make you extreme. It makes you independent in the quietest way possible. If this perspective stayed with you, take a moment to let the algorithm know by liking the video. If you've noticed similar shifts, or felt that margin thinning in your own way, share it in the comments. And if you want to keep exploring the ideas we've forgotten, follow TDA Channel. Not to be told what to do, but to keep remembering what still works.